Query from a coach during the week, looking at how through his coaching he can positively impact their well-being. He's also looking to see how that can have knock-on positive, negative effects to the students he teaches every day, working as a primary teacher. Over the course of my PhD, I looked a lot at well-being and sport and how they interact. And one of the big things that came up was how long-term, fully intrinsic motivation can have really positive impacts on well-being, but also on performance. We're going to look at one of the main theories of motivation today and see how that can be used to get your players more bought into what it is you're trying to do, but also positively impact their well-being and relationship with the sport. We look at this across a few different sections, so I've broken up with a couple of different subheadings up here in front of me that I'll use as a guide, and I'll break those down a bit further as we go along. So we'll start off just looking at what is long-term motivation and well-being and how they combine together and interact upon each other. We'll look at just a little bit of the background and previous guidance around this, around where I've taken stuff from, but also what's influenced what we're going to talk about today. Look at different types of motivation, because ultimately that becomes important as to why the main thing we talk about today is following on from the different types of motivation, because how the players that you're working with are motivated can have a big impact on, overall the well-being as such, what we talk about, but also how long-term it goes to. Self-determination theory is going to be the big thing. That's kind of the main concept we're going to look at here today, and the three different tenets within that. And then more importantly, this is where I want to spend the majority of time, is looking at actually practical examples or applications of these, and try where possible to look at these, because I know the listenership of this is somewhat varied in terms of the age range, the coaches and the players that listen to this. So I'll try to give examples across the range that can be applied, and then we'll have a quick little wrap up around a couple of, not so much do's and don'ts, or actually more don'ts, or maybe these aren't the situations to use this in. So we'll start off. This will be both, there'll be a video and audio of this. I'm going to try this one as well, put up the video on Spotify. It's largely just a screen record of me talking about the various bullet points. But just looking at long-term motivation and well-being in players. So how can theories of motivation be used to look at the long-term buy-in of players? So we often think of motivation as before the game, you're in the dressing room and someone gives a big massive speech and we're all pumped up and we go out and we play really well. And I even remember, I was thinking of this as I was watching Six Nations match the other day, particularly Scotland anthem as class, gets you so fired up. And I remember, I think it was around 07, 08, the time Ireland had the disastrous World Cup, and former players came on and said, I think the big reason Ireland aren't doing well in a lot of rugby games is because Ireland's call doesn't get them fired up enough. And that got a lot of traction. And it shows how our viewpoints of motivation have changed so much. Could you realistically imagine Joe Schmidt firing up the players before a match? I can't remotely consider Andy Farrell doing the same, and if we're to come across Jay, I can't imagine Paul Kirk or John Kiley doing that with Limerick players either. It's very much focused around the long term of what it is they're trying to do and the main things they're trying to be really, really good at. And the long term is a really important thing here. It's the consistent turning up the trend, and not just turning up, but putting in the effort in the right areas. Doing the gym sessions as a group, or even more importantly, the ones you have to go and do on your own. The eating right constantly, 4 to 5 meals a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year for 8, 10, 12, 15 years on end, and all the various bits of recovery around that. No big speech is getting you pumped for that. I remember in college watching workout videos of American football teams, oh, I'm so pumped, I'll go do a good gym session now. But you can't rely on that forever, it runs out. And looking at the other side of this, is because it's become so popular. I've actually had an experienced coach on to me about this during the week, just because my background, my research area is around well-being, physical activity, and I'll touch on that now in a second. But he's looking at how can well-being impact our players in both directions. So will us trying to improve their well-being for them lead to better performances, and vice versa? How can the better performances impact across on well-being? And that's both really aligned with motivation, because there's so many different definitions of well-being out there. It's something I really struggled with during my studies, was to I couldn't nail down one. They're just so varied. But one of the big guiding principles that we're taken from would have been having a sense of purpose, engagement and meaning in what it is you're doing, and particularly in something bigger or greater than you, or bigger than the whole. To look at some kind of I suppose, background and previous guidance around this, I just want to make a few points that I'm not a sports psychologist. I have no ambitions to be a sports psychologist and do not work on it in any way. But I did my PhD on physical activity and mental health, particularly focused on the positive well-being side of things. And the main focus there was on like contexts or environments. So not so much the specific activities you do, but the harder to measure stuff that still makes stuff feel good or bad. Like everyone knows what this is. It's you go train and there's just a general vibe of, yes, this is a place I enjoy going to, or it's a place I don't particularly enjoy going to at all. And there's loads of like small factors that impact on that, but they can be very hard to list or define or state explicitly what they are. In terms of like my studies, so my first study, I found national questionnaire, adolescents who played a number of sports and or a team sport had the highest well-being. And that's like well-being objectively measured. I used the Warwick Edinburgh well-being scale if you ever want to go and look into some of that there. And then the follow-up studies looked at why. So my final paper there, it was called Self-Esteem, Meaningful Experiences and the Rocky Road. And the big things that came out in that impacted upon well-being or potentially had impacts upon sport. I'm never entirely certain of what direction it works in, but so the self-esteem, like the playing sport and the being physically active, there was very little around like endorphins or you feel really good after exercise. Like over the long term, that wears off. If you're training 4 or 5 times a week for years, you don't get the same level of endorphins. It's not that's having the impact on it. But increases in self-esteem, true increases in skills or in fitness or in just getting better at what it is you're doing, that has a big impact on your broader self-esteem. And through a series of focus groups, we were finding that applied across to other avenues in life then as well. That if you realise, if I put in time and effort to getting better at something through just applied application here, that's something that can carry across to other skills in life. There was an importance around it not being your whole identity, and I think this is where the playing a number of sports is really important. That if you just play hurling and you go out and a big part of your identity is hurling and you go out and you play a bad game, it has such a negative impact on your mood over time. Or if you have an injury, or like we've seen studies on athletes who retire and how much they struggle with various bits because they didn't really have other aspects of their broader identity. And I remember in a few of the focus groups, some participants saying how like sport is so important, but it can't be the only important thing. It's really good to, number one, play a number of sports, but also to have other activities and interests outside of sport. I remember one lad saying he was mad into basketball, but he was also into like randomly enough greyhound racing. And he'd go off on a Saturday night and play a basketball game. And if he won, he played well, he was in great humour on Saturday. But if he lost and played bad, he would go to the greyhound race the next day and no one knew a thing about it. They just knew him as the lad who was there at that racing. And it was a sense to like build back up and to escape from like stuff that went wrong, but also just to apply yourself across and maybe forget about and put away the bad stuff, but still have the knock-on benefits of the good stuff because you still have that little boost in confidence. While no one explicitly said it, we did touch on examples of flow states, just on like when something goes well. I remember a girl who was a dancer saying when just a dance comes off, it feels perfect. She couldn't put it into words, but there was just this sense of elation afterwards. I nailed that. And a couple of rugby players said, well, when you just spin a pass perfectly and you hit someone at the right time, or you get that really sweet strike of a slitter with the hurl. And a lot of those are like finding the states where you're just fully engrossed in the activity you're doing and how that can have a positive impact again overall to your mental health and well-being. Getting a little bit deeper on a few bits then, these took a little bit longer to tease out, but I think long term are probably the bigger ones, is seeing the reasons behind your training. And that ties back to the meaningful experiences bit I put in the title. That if you see why you're doing the training you're doing and the activities lead into something bigger, and we look at examples of this later on, you're more likely to be bought in and as such motivated to turn up and do it, but also to put in the full max effort and to support all around that, like having your gear ready in advance, having yourself fit and ready to train at the times you're going to train, everything like that. And just to encourage others around you and to try and just do things as right as possible, not just go through the motions or do the activity part, but give it the full effort mentally and physically to what it is you're trying to do, just to fully execute stuff. The sense of belonging was really important. And even like we split up our focus groups, we looked at team sport athletes, individual sport athletes, and I know there can be differences there, and those who are or self-identified as inactive. But even in those who like would have been individual sport athletes, dancers, swimmers, like cross-country runners and stuff, they still spoke about the sense of community and how important it was to be part of a particular dancing group. Or on cross-country, because there's a team element to it, you're still cheering on the people you're trying to get over the line, and you do, like, because it's very rare you train completely isolated on your own. There is a big part of the community there. It was far more apparent in the team sport players, and they spoke about it a lot. Like, the sense of belonging wasn't even something I brought up, like, or identified afterwards from what they said. Some I just said, well, it's just the whole sense of belonging. You're part of a group, you're part of a club, you're representing something that's not just yourself or your friends, it's something broader. And then the final point I'll touch on here is just around the setbacks and losses and the resilience that comes from, like, ultimately, not many people win everything. If you're an individual athlete, it's very rare you win every race you enter. If you're a team sport player, again, it's rare you win everything. You have the odd team who is dominant at underage or sometimes at adult, but ultimately you do probably end up losing more than you win throughout your career, and that goes for majority players. But all those setbacks and losses, they develop the resilience. But one of the big things that helps develop that resilience is the actual inbuilt support group around you. Your teammates, your coaches, your parents, the other people, or just the general supporters of the team in general, all help you to overcome that sense of loss. And I think it's maybe not the tools that they're explicitly given, but that support in itself helps to develop resilience through maybe looking back and reflecting on your losses, or maybe just having something else to talk about as you have the time to grieve, isn't the word, but come to terms with those losses that you experience inevitably through sport. An awful lot of my studies in general, so I did an intervention and a couple of focus group based studies, they were very heavily reliant on and guided by self-determination theory. And that's largely what we're going to talk about next. We're going to jump in a little bit here first to just different types of motivation, and we'll look at why that's important. So just four, like there's numerous ones here, but 4 main ones we look at here: intrinsic motivation, extrinsic motivation, controlled motivation, and aim motivation. So intrinsic motivation is what comes from within the player themselves. So an example of that, I'll give you like a wing back in Camogie, and she's trying to improve her sideline cut technique, as she just wants to be better at it. She understands herself that she will get a kick from being better at hitting a sideline cut, getting it higher, it travelling further, and she just get a sense of achievement or accomplishment internally from that. She's not trying to impress anyone else. It's not part of a broader competition. She doesn't get points or anything for it in the game. She's not able to cut it that far, but she wants to cut it at a distance that will seem an improvement to her. Or say like an under 8, just trying to complete a few quality lifts in a row, like be the pick up right and left in Gaelic football, or a few good row lifts, just for their own satisfaction. Now, generally you'd say that under 8s wouldn't be overly aware of doing stuff like that, but they will get the little sense of achievement. Extrinsic motivation then is something that's coming from external to the player. So an example of that would be like an inter-county player trying to push themselves in training and in matches and play well and win as much as possible, to have the chance of trying to win an all-star at the end of it. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with this, but they're trying to be noticed by external people and get the external validation of an award at the end of it all. Not even necessarily the cup or the medal, but the actual, you are a really good player here, the best in your position, and we're putting you on this team. Or maybe even a Player of the Year award. That has potential benefits in the short term, but ultimately in the long term they don't really seem to work out. And like, say you go and win a provincial championship, an All-Ireland final, play really well in All-Ireland final day, but don't win an All-Star award, and that's the external motivator you had, like that will ultimately lead to some level of disappointment, which, having won all of that, isn't really a great way to have a relationship with your sport. Like an example in a younger player would be like a parent saying, if you go train, I'll buy you a bag of sweets. Like, again, long term, never mind like the relationships of food and stuff here, it's probably not a good thing overall. Now sometimes as a hook to get them in and like hopefully they'll really enjoy the training, it's getting them to go the first time, little things like that may be useful, but ultimately the extrinsic motivation isn't always the best means in the long term. Another example then is, or another type is controlled motivation. So it's also something external to the player, but it's more like a forced effort or commitment. So I've actually heard this recently in an inter-county team, and just around punishments or accountability for players who do something, and I'll say quote unquote here, wrong, or miss out on something, that they have to do something to be accountable for what they did wrong, or have to be punished in some way. Let it be a fine for someone who arrived late to train, or has to complete a bronco for not logging sessions in the gym, or players doing push-ups for mistakes during drills. And again, if you use it once or twice to cut things out, potentially it may work. It wouldn't be the route I would go in the majority of cases, but some may find it helps to just cut bad habits out early on and then build in other types of motivation. But ultimately, I think it does tend to lead to more negative relationships mentally with both exercise and also whatever the negative consequences you put in there. It can really lead to seeing them in more of a bad light. And the final one touching here is amotivation. So that's essentially just a lack of motivation in general on the part of the player, and that's like a lack of interest in the sport, around playing, spectating, attending, and actually is often aligned with like physical and mental burnout or whatever like that. The main bit then I want to look at now, just to give a bit of an overview before we go into our practical stuff, is around self-determination theory. So it is a theory of motivation proposed by DC and Ryan. Actually, not as old a theory. I thought it was a really old theory, but when I was going into all this around my lit review a few years ago, I was like, well, it's newer than I expected. But there's three main arms or components or tenets, as they're known. They're autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And autonomy is just feeling in control of your own actions, or having an element of choice around what it is you do, or some form of ownership around your activities and your choices. Competence then is mastery or effectiveness in activities, or is essentially getting better at stuff, but noticing and realising you're getting better at stuff, or becoming more competent, hence where the name comes from. And then the last bit is relatedness, and probably a little bit more obvious. It's just that connection with others, generally in the sense of other people, but also a connectedness to something bigger, something greater, a wider community, the parish, the county, the club, whatever it might be there. And this is really important in the long term for commitment and just general application to sport, but also for like health in general. And like a good few studies across a good few different sports. One really interesting one on, I remember reading one on swimming and how to just use the self-determination theory-based approach to a group of swimmers, and just the really positive outcomes that had in terms of performance, but also long-term motivation to stay swimming. And coaches who lean on or are guided by self-determination theory just have way higher levels of intrinsic motivation and well-being in their players. And with all of the great work sports psychologists do, and I'm lining up a few sports psychologists to come on over the next while to look at different avenues there, is that having a more solid foundation in your broader mental health and well-being can just lead to so many positive benefits in your performance. But likewise, the opposite of that, negative spaces in terms of mental health and well-being can really negatively impact your performance on the pitch or wherever your performance is. Main bit here now, we want to look at some practical examples or applications across autonomy, competence, relatedness, how you can tie that into your coaching practices. We'll look at them in isolation first, and then we'll start looking at how we can maybe see a few potential activities you can do to combine them all in different ways, and maybe rely on one more so than another at any stage. Just like I mentioned this earlier in one of my first podcasts around how just a questionnaire at the start of the season can be so helpful to just tease out a few little bits of information. How much ownership or autonomy you want to give your players is going to be dependent on what you're comfortable with, how well you know them, and how much you're willing to give up, and that can change as your experience goes up. But one simple one, provided there is the flexibility there to do it, is to just look at what are the most suitable training days and times. Do you prefer to train at, you're asking the players this, do you prefer to train at 7:30 or 8? And like, while it might be a small thing, can actually make a massive difference based on where some of them work, what they need to get home for afterwards, and that way. Do they prefer a Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday split, or a Wednesday, Friday, Sunday split? And giving them those options and having them, like, some of them having to, you know, some players might not care in the slightest, and some might be really, I won't say passionate, but like controlled around what days they can or can't train based on work commitments or family commitments. So having a little bit of choice around that can make a huge difference to them. So the fact they've fed into that can then help them feel an awful lot more bought into then training when they are there. I use this myself a good bit. Over the course of pre-season and league, I'll do a few different like ramp-based warm-ups, so 3 or 4 different warm-ups. They'll generally include the skills, the sport, hurling, football, camogie, ladies football. They'll follow their ramp protocol. They'll have a few of the main exercises like in there. And then when it comes up to championship, I'll just ask players, which one do you prefer? Or do you want to take elements from a few of them and piece them all together? And you'll find most, I don't really care, I just want to be warmed up. But 2 or 3 will be like, yeah, I really like that one and I really hate that one. And just by changing those around, like, they're still going to be warmed up. They'll still include the main bits you want to include in there. But if it's a warm-up the players just prefer doing, well, they just feel more bought in and they give more effort to that. And hopefully are more prepared then for the game when it does come around. I don't know if I said this before in the podcast, but I generally don't really like cool downs. Don't see a huge benefit to them. But I'll do them after matches because everyone expects you to do one. So I'll often just let the players lead that themselves. And if there's 2 or 3 players that often are really passionate about saying we have to stretch and we have to do this, grand, you can take the lead on that here. Or you can say 3 things you want to include in the cool down, I'll make sure it's done. And again, they feel bought into what they're doing. Around gym stuff here, this is what I like doing, particularly when players get a little bit more experienced. So just giving them a few little options they can include. So as their core lift, I might want it to be a squat. They can decide themselves if it's a front squat, a back squat, or a box squat. That's dependent on them having the proficiency to do them all. For upper body lifts, you can again, if it's a bench press, it can be the option of dumbbell bench or barbell bench, again provided they have the proficiency to do both. Simple one will not have any impact on performance or anything like that. But if like younger players, I used to use this a lot with school teams, was if we're going to a match, I'd let them create their own playlist and I'd either want them to have it on their phones, I bring along a speaker and they play it. And again, they all just pick one song or pick 2 songs or 2 or 3 even put together the whole playlist. But again, they feel they've put this together. If at the higher level and budgets allow and you're putting together meals for after matches, again, getting the players to have some input there into what type of meals they have. I know I haven't been involved as a nutritionist with teams before. A couple of times caterers would have food and players like, we hate this stuff. So it's just find out from a few of them a couple of bits they do and don't like, relay that back and hopefully you can have the impact around it there. And even at a lower level, well, I suppose not a lower level, but just around naming stuff, largely harmless. But if you're coming up with certain formations or types of play or fixed plays and whatever way you set them up or kick-out formations, even just getting the players to come up with the names of them, the purple formation, the orange formation or +1, or just giving it titles, again, because they've come up with it, first of all, they're probably more likely to remember it, but it gives them the element of buy-in to what it is they're doing. And that's how, like, there's some different examples of how you can give players some sense of autonomy or choice to feel a bit more bought in. Some will be more relevant to like younger players or older players or teams or whatever, and also just knowing like what the group you're working with are like and what they like. We move on then to competence. So this is the getting better at, but also realizing you are getting better at. And one of like the big ones here is, as a coach, try and praise effort and not outcomes. So if you know someone comes up to the pitch and just hits a ball or kicks a ball really well, that's a really good kick. Whereas if you praise someone who has put in the effort to improve their kicking technique over time, that will lead to them seeing that putting in effort is what leads to praise. So that's why putting in the effort to get better at stuff is the real key there. Your classic feedback sandwich there, to highlight the things they've done well, but give them something to try and get a little bit better at for next time and close it off with something positive. An example there is, say it's taking a free. You're raising the slitter to a really nice height there, taking the free. I'd like to see you follow through after a little bit more, but I like the way your hands are firmly together with the grip on the hurl. So it's those 2 little boosts of confidence either side, showing them things are doing well, but something to go and try and be a little bit better at the next time. Another example, say from teaching here, is the medals and the missions. Give them a medal for something they've done well. I'd love to see you trying to practice your left foot more. Mission then is to try and let's have a bit more follow through or put more distance or accuracy on that kick. Once you've started praising effort or the players have realised that putting in effort is important, this is where you can start putting in some like skill-based stations that might be available for players when they arrive. This does not need to be an elaborate thing. But just even if you have a hurling wall, having a few targets on it and a couple of slitters left down so players can actually come up and practice hitting those targets, or a couple of little rising drills, or set up a few cones certain distances apart to practice their sideline cuts, or have 2 kicking stations, one from the right side, one from the left side, and encourage players to use a bit of both before and after training. Stuff like that can be a really good crack after training too, having little skills development stations or whoever it might be. Make sure you're celebrating any notable improvements for like individuals on the team, but also the group in general. Sometimes, like particularly if it's a weaker player and they've gotten better at one particular skill, you might not need to, depending on their personality, you might not need to let the whole group know, look how good Mary has gotten here or Jimmy has gotten here at this thing, and the other players like, gosh, we were good at that a year ago. You might need to be careful on how you layer stuff like that in, but going up to them as individuals, say, I have noticed how much better you have gotten at high catching. That's purely down to your practice and effort here. Delighted to see it. And they'll go home like 10 feet taller afterwards. Or also like team-based stuff. If you see them going from like a lot of kick and catch play or just strike and wherever it goes, to starting to link various bits of play together. Celebrate that and make sure they know it's good and they've improved at. And if you have a couple of numbers to back it up, brilliant again. There's a bit of debate around this. I still think it's worth doing this. Like, put in some easy or basic drills, whether this be for hurling or football or whatever you're playing, and like just let them feel really good at something. Ultimately, we do want to be challenged for the majority of training, but sometimes those little bits, and if it's a case of you want a bit more physical output, so you layer down this complexity of the skill demands or challenges that are there, but also just show, look, you're really tired, but you're still executing all these skills well here. That can be that little boost in confidence. You don't want a majority of training based on that, but it can be really helpful for little bits of confidence and in themselves and in your training to help them feel bought in there. Fitness levels can be an easy enough one to use to show increases in competence. That ultimately, if you like fitness test, whatever time trial distance you use, or Bronco or beep test that way, and do a decent block of training, the majority are more than likely going to improve a decent amount. And just highlight that, look at that improvement, look at that 12% improvement over time, great stuff. Or their trap bar deadlift has gone from 140 to 155 over an 8-week block, great, well done. The fitness can be really good here. It's a simple enough one, it's quite measurable, and provided there's a bit of buy-in from players, they will improve from it. You just need a bit of tracking over time there. What I'm torn on, I think there's pros and cons to it, and I'm not sure how much one outweighs the other. I think with younger players can be useful if used in the right way, are skills assessments. I think ultimately, I don't know how much carryover they actually have to the game, but sometimes to show little small improvements and help increase confidence in players, they can be useful. For example, just for a hurler, how many strikes off the wall they can get in 30 seconds. If they can go from 10 or 12 successful ones to 18 to 20, that's a nice boost in confidence for the player. How much better they will be at striking in games, I'm not entirely sure, but it can show just that boost in, look, you are getting better at something here. Let's now try and apply that to our more game-based situations. And tying in with that last point then, just like trying to highlight the progressive increase in difficulty of your drills or your games. Say for example, if you do like a little passing formation that leads to a score, and then you add in a defender, then you add in 2 defenders. And over the course of a few weeks, they get better and better at it despite it getting harder and harder. Highlight that to the players so they see how much better they're getting, because you have to make it harder for them for it to be an applicable game or applicable activity. Or even if you're doing some kind of shot clock based activity and saying, we had to start doing this with 35 seconds and it's come down to 20 over the course of the last few weeks because you're getting so much better at transition up the field. We'll move on then to relatedness based activities. And in the process of lining someone up who's truly an expert in team building based stuff, both from a practical and academic point of view, but hopefully that'll come to fruition sooner along. But sometimes the more organic stuff can be way more useful here. And just giving players time to connect during, before or around their training sessions. And that can be like just having a little bit of food left out from afterwards, like very low budget stuff. Or give them a chance to chat and congregate over something small. Like let's go somewhere as a group. Let's get a bus to this game instead of going in loads of different cars. Since COVID or whatever, the use of just showers and change rooms afterwards is not remotely as common in female teams either. But having times where they come together so they actually organically chat, that can often have the biggest impact of all around just getting to feel a bit more relating stuff to each other. I mentioned earlier around the playlist and stuff, and again, there can be a bit of crack around that, like, oh my god, you have the worst taste in music, and just leading to light, low levels of fun and chat between players can be really helpful. You as a coach, try and chat to your players about something not related to hurling or football or camogie, around like school or college or their job, or just general interest they have, because it's not just about the players being more related to each other, but you relating to them based on like what you're comfortable with and your personality there, and how much of like where you want that line drawn, and that is different for every coach, and that's completely understandable too. And then just looking at like organising a few events to help your players bond together, and they do not all need to be big drinking sessions, or they do need to be going climbing a mountain together. And this is where you can hand over little bits of autonomy based on like what's acceptable in the group. But it can be, let's do a training session on a beach and go for coffee or breakfast afterwards. Let's go to a local adventure centre and do a bit of kayaking or a bit of orienteering. Let's, as a group, come up with a fundraiser for the club, and it's a car wash, or it's I heard of a local group doing an ice bath challenge, how long they could keep people in ice baths for. There's just a bit of crack and a sense of community in all the various bits there. And the relatedness doesn't always have to be just between the players or you and the players, but even just connecting to the wider community and stuff then as well. A couple of combined activities that can impact across the various categories or tenets, as we call them. I remember hearing a talk with the Galway minor manager, Jeff, second name escapes me here now, but he was saying he found match reviews so important, splitting the players up in small groups of 3 to 5, and just getting to review simple aspects, say what are the things we did well there in terms of attack, in terms of defence, or you find the areas you want them to highlight themselves. So they're highlighting to each other and to themselves the various areas that they are competent in, and then look for 1 or 2 small, without being critical of each other, ways to improve, handing over those bits of autonomy. If we want to be better at shooting, if we want to be better at defending, what are ways we can incorporate that into training? And it shows you as a coach are trusting them, trusting their opinion. And you don't have to like do everything they say or incorporate it the exact way they say, but you are taking on board their opinions and showing there is validity in what they're saying, and you're willing to take it on board, but it's them as a group coming up with the suggestions as well. A couple of other combined ones, I touched on questionnaires before, but again, they can just really feel like they're involved in the coaching process, and how you carefully structure your questions there, and like rely on AI, ChatGPT, Claude, any of those for suggestions around coaching related review or feedback questionnaires. What are 8 sample questions you could ask? Looking at like potential leaders and leadership group and dividing them out amongst the group, because you'll see factions around different sections of the parish, or different age groups might split up, and looking at ways without forcing it to try and get them to interact with each other, but give it a project with a bit of sense of purpose around it, like a fundraiser, like putting the backs together, and they're going to come up with a couple of setups for taking short puck outs, or the forwards, what is our best strategy to cope with what this team is about to do with us, and set them a challenge, identify a couple of leaders, but ensure everyone's voice is heard in whatever it is you're doing. Looking at like the long term around certain aspects of play and getting them to try and master these. And an example to take from soccer was when Pep Guardiola was in his early days at Barcelona. He wasn't looking at let's win numerous Champions Leagues or let's win the Ligas or try and do the double. Let's get really, really good at what they call then tiki-taka, this passing formation through it, and let's try and get really, really good at that. And they broke that down to their smaller sections of how do we work it out up the line, or how do we work it through the middle, or how do we get these link players, and how do we use reverse passes. And by getting it all better at all of those, and using the players to feed into how they get better, and I wonder sometimes how much ownership Pep gave any of his players, but by getting better at all those, it led to better performances. And it's the same here, not just saying our aim is to go out and win, our aim is to go out and be really good at one-on-one defence, working the ball up the wings, hard pressing their kick out. And if you can get really good at that, it will lead to a better performance. And that ties into like focus on stuff that the players are in control of and that they can have a serious impact on, or a controlled impact on. A few points to wrap up then. A lot of this does depend on your coaching style and the group you're working with in terms of their age, their ability, but also the various personalities through the group. the overall responsibility of what a team does is largely still yours. It's not just a case of you trying to offload responsibility, and if things suddenly go wrong, well, I asked the players what they wanted to do, and they said they wanted to go man for man and let the opposition win short puckouts, whatever it might be. If you know that's a silly idea, like, you don't have to do every single thing they say exactly as they say it. You're listening to them, you're taking their feedback on board, but it's still only like trying to give you an informed opinion as opposed to saying this is exactly what to do and this is the way we're going to do it. You are still the coach. You're put in that position for a reason. Someone obviously trusted you. It can help to develop trust between you and the players, but it doesn't necessarily mean you do every single the players tell you to do, but you can be informed by little bits they say. Also, in terms of impacting or trying to put in place any of this stuff, don't try and do it all at once. Some things might really suit you, your style, your players, some might not. If you try and do them all at once, it'll just be too much to try and concentrate on at once, to try and change. And if it's having positive effects, it can actually be hard to identify what's having the most positive effect. Or if it's having negative effects, it can also be hard to identify what's actually having the negative effects. So have a think around what could work for my players here. Let's implement a bit of that. What definitely wouldn't? No, it's not for me, it's not for my group. Is there a slight twist of coupon that might work? Try it. I'd love to hear back from anyone what they have used in the past and has been successful, or if you look to trial any of these out over the next while, I'd love to hear the feedback on it. And also, thank you very much to everyone. There's been some big shares and listens on the podcast over the last 2 weeks in particular. Get some really good feedback on it. So thanks everyone for listening, but also for sharing it around, whether it be the link across to other people or tweets on social media or sharing through stories. Really appreciate that. And if there are a couple of suggestions around other things you'd like to dig into over the next while, I am very much on board with all those as well.